Hello, everybody, and welcome to my Kamigawa Neon Dynasty limited set review. In this video, I'm going to be going through every single common in the set and talking about how to use them in draft, where you should be picking them in the pack, and overall just analyzing all of the cards. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, and comment below with your questions, thoughts, and feedback. One thing I will note before I get started is that I'm not going to be giving every single card an A or a B or grade level in that way. I'm going to be talking about the card holistically, what you should be doing with it, whether or not it's going to be a card you have to pick highly or whether it's a card you can get later, that sort of thing, because draft is so malleable and different depending on the exact situation that you're in that I don't think giving a grade is all that useful. However, if you are interested in grades on the cards, I do have a tier list available for Kamigawa Neon Dynasty available on the NicolaiBolas Patreon. So if you're interested in supporting my content and gaining access to that sort of letter grade approach in an easily viewable spreadsheet, then you can find that there. But let's get started. Starting off with Ancestral Katana, this is an equipment. There are themes in the set, and I'm going to address the themes as specific cards that talk about those themes come up, but Ancestral Katana plays with several of the themes in the set. There is a theme in red-white that cares about your creatures attacking alone, specifically your samurais or warriors. There is a modified theme that is found in several different colors, but modified is when your creature is equipped, has an aura on it, or has a counter on it. And then there is also a theme that cares about you having artifacts, and that is found in black-white, where it cares about you having an artifact and an enchantment in play. And Ancestral Katana kind of just is a segue of some of those strategies, but mostly the red-white strategy with the samurais and warriors. Overall, I don't think it's a card you're going to want to be prioritizing highly because it is inefficient for what it does, and it's very narrow in what it does. So if you're playing a red-white deck and you want access to this, you should be able to get it later because the decks that care about modified will be looking for better ways to get their creatures modified, and the decks that care about artifacts will be looking for other ways to get their artifacts. So you can get this card late. It's not particularly efficient if you're not doing the warrior samurai thing. It remains to be seen how powerful that warrior samurai deck is going to be, but even if it's a really good deck, you're not going to want to be first picking this sort of card. This is the sort of card you're going to want to be getting on like the wheel or things like that. Next up is Befriending the Moths. It is a saga card, and the way sagas work is when they enter the battlefield, they get a lore counter, and then after your draw step, they get a lore counter. So when it comes into play, it's going to have its first effect. When the next thing ticks down, it's going to have the effect again, and then it's going to flip. And so the way Befriending the Moths works is it's a 4-mana card that gives +1/+1 and flying until end of turn for 2 turns in a row, so it can give your creatures evasion. It does play well with the samurai theme, because if you're only attacking with one creature, buffing that creature up and giving it flying is nice. It also potentially plays well with enchantment synergies or things of that nature, or it could play well with some of the ninjas in the set that care about hitting your opponent, because there is a ninja theme, and ninjas often have combat damage triggers when they deal damage to the opponent. And what Befriending the Moths does when it flips is it becomes a 2/4 flyer. So 4 mana for a couple of triggers and then a 2/4 flyer is a lot of effects for 4 mana. The fact that the flyer comes at the end does make it a little bit weaker, but it doesn't seem like unreasonable that this card would be good. Though, again, I don't think you really need to prioritize it because it only is going to be good in your aggressive decks and only really good in a subset of aggressive decks that kind of need the extra evasion or boost, because I don't think you're going to really want that card outside of that. So I don't think it's really going to be a high pick. Next up is Dragonfly Suit. It is a vehicle, and there is a small vehicles theme in the set. Blue-white in particular has a little bit more synergy with vehicles than some of the other colors, but vehicles basically are creatures that aren't creatures. They are creatures if you crew them, which means you tap creatures with power that is equal to the crew cost on the vehicle. So in this case, it is a 3/2 flyer for 3, but it has to be crewed by a creature, and that creature can have 1 power or really any power. It doesn't have to be exact. But Dragonfly Suit does look like a good card for a vehicle deck. A 3-mana 3/2 flyer does hit quite hard. One cool thing to note about crew costs is it doesn't really care about summoning sickness. So with all of the vehicles, you can just kind of crew them immediately, which is really nice. So like you play this on turn 3, on turn 4, you play your 4-drop, and then you use that to crew, so it kind of gives your creatures a usage on the turn you're playing them. Vehicles tend to be a little bit better in aggressive decks because if you're trying to use them to block, then you are like tapping one of your other blockers to make a different blocker, which isn't particularly good because you're not being able to block. So you'd rather just have 2 creatures in that case so you can do more blocking stuff. But they are pretty good aggressive threats. They dodge sorcery speed removal, and they can be pretty scary in the right situation. This one looks like it hits pretty hard, and so in a vehicles deck, it could be pretty good, or even just in a white aggressive deck that just cares about having this sort of thing. Next up is Eiganjo Exemplar. 2-drops are really important in Limited, and this is an enchantment creature for things that care about that. It's a samurai for things that care about that. And it also has one of the samurai triggers of buffing up the creature, giving it +1/+1. So if it is attacking by itself, it attacks as a 3/2 early on in the game. Even though it does have like 1 toughness, which can be a weakness, overall it seems like the types of 2-drop that hits pretty hard and can also be relatively effective later on, even if it's just by itself. The fact that it's an enchantment creature and a samurai means it might be playable in multiple different strategies. And so overall, I think Eiganjo Exemplar looks like it could be a card that you're taking decently high in the pack. Maybe not like first pick or second or in that like the top tier of ranges, but like midway through the pack, you're like, okay, I need a 2-drop, and getting some 2-drops is pretty powerful. So Eiganjo Exemplar could be finding a pretty good home in that situation. Next is Era of Enlightenment, another saga, and the way this one works is you scry 2, and then you gain 2, and then it will flip into Hand of Enlightenment, which is a 2/2 first strike. So by the time this comes down, if you played early in the game, you're going to get a 2/2 first strike by around turn 4, which is still in a point where a 2/2 first strike is relevant, but as the course of the game goes on, a 2/2 first strike becomes a little bit less and less relevant. The thing with this sort of saga is it's not particularly good in an aggressive strategy because you want to be affecting the board as much as possible when you're in an aggressive strategy, so taking in delay to get a then 2/2 creature isn't the best. But in a more mid-rangey deck, maybe with one that has equipments or things of that nature, you can use the scry 2 to like set up your draws, you gain a couple life, and then you get a creature out of the bargain at the end of the deal. And overall, it could be finding a nice home there. Again, I don't think it's like universally powerful, so I don't think it's the sort of card that you're going to want to be playing in every single strategy or every white deck, so I don't think you have to take it super highly, but it can find the right home. It can find a home in the right deck. Next up is Golden Tail Disciple. Pretty straightforward. It's an enchantment creature, so that's really worth noting, and it is a 2/3 life linker for 3. So that's just decent stat line. It's nothing too impressive, not going to be a high priority in any deck, but the fact that it's an enchantment creature does play well with some of the set's themes, and it's probably just like a mid-tier card that you'll get like partway through the pack that you don't really have to prioritize. If you need one, you'll get it probably, and could play out decently in your deck. It's not really an aggressive card because a 2/3 isn't the best stats for aggro, but it's fine in any other deck. Next is Imperial Oath, a card that actually I think is a really cool design because it gets you 3 samurais for 1 card. So if you do have a bunch of those samurai triggers running around, and then you can just keep sending these 2/2 vigilance guys into the red zone. You also get to scry to set up your draws a bit because after turn 6, you don't really want to draw any more lands. So that could potentially be like worth some percentage of a card. Again, it's really narrow. I don't think you want this card outside of the samurai deck. So probably like only really good in red-white, though you can just play this sort of card in like any white deck if you just need a like top-end card. It's mostly going to thrive in the red-white deck, so not really a card that you need to take early and because it's not super flexible, but it seems like it could have a good home in that deck. Next is Imperial Subduer, another card that's really only good in like the vampire, in the samurai deck. But I think it's another card that could potentially be pretty nice because it gets rid of one of your opponent's problematic blockers when you are attacking with the samurai, and just kind of fuels those engines a little bit. I don't think it's going to be good outside of that really, because most aggro decks want to be able to attack with multiple creatures a turn, and this guy doesn't really let you do that. But I mean, because you won't get the trigger in a 3-mana 3/2, if it was vanilla, would just not be very good. And so overall, I don't think it's a high priority, but again, a nice role player for those samurai decks. Next is Intercessor's Arrest. This is one of those cards that I think could be a very high pick because oftentimes this sort of effect in white is going to be one of the better commons. It enchants a permanent. So that means you can enchant a creature, you can enchant a vehicle. That's primarily what you're going to be enchanting with this sort of thing. It can't attack or block, which is really key, and it can't crew vehicles, which is also really key. Because in a set with vehicles, if it could still crew vehicles, then maybe putting the enchantment on it doesn't really do much, but they made sure to get that, and then it can't activate abilities unless it's like tapping for mana. So don't put this on your opponent's mana dork, but otherwise it's going to take care of the creature pretty much, and I think that's very good, and good text to have on this sort of card. So I think this is going to be a pretty high pick. This is one of those ones that you can take very early because any white deck is going to be interested. It does have the enchantment type, so it'll play well with enchantment themes as well, which is especially relevant in this sort of set for some of the archetypes. And so Intercessor's Arrest seems like a high pick to me and quite a good card in the set. Next up is Kitsune Ace, a 2-mana 2/2, which isn't quite good enough on its own generally, so it does need a little bit of extra help. And this one does get that help if it is played in a vehicle's deck. So this may only be good if you have a few vehicles, but the fact that it can give a vehicle first strike in particular is really nice, because it does mean that that vehicle will be pretty much unblockable, because vehicles are often quite large. And the fact that you can untap Kitsune Ace means it plays well if your vehicle happens to have Vigilance, because then you can crew, untap the Kitsune Ace, and then you can crew the vehicle again on your opponent's turn. So it really plays well with specific vehicles, and it's a card I'll look for in my vehicle decks, but probably not be super excited to play outside of that. Though, of course, a 2-mana 2/2 is certainly playable in a pinch, even if it doesn't have any relevant abilities for your deck. Next up is Light the Way, a card that looks a little bit weak on its surface, but does have some nice synergies in the deck in like this format. So it's worth looking at depending on the deck you're playing. It's not going to be a high pick by any means, but if you care about having modified creatures, which includes creatures with +1/+1 counters on them, this could be a card that you're looking for. And then the extra upside of being able to sometimes like save your creature from removal by returning it to your the owner's hand can be quite nice as well. So Light the Way, not a high pick, a card you can get later on probably, but also pretty nice to have if you are looking to get a modified deck going. Next is Lucky Offering, a card that's going to depend on the matchup, I think. Some decks aren't going to really care about artifacts. They might focus more on enchantments. Some decks might not have any, but I think it's going to be at the very least a very strong sideboard card, because there are a decent number of artifact creatures, and so having like a 1-mana way to kill one of your opponent's like 3-drop creatures and then gain 3 life could just be absolutely devastating out of the sideboard. So I think it is a sideboard card. I don't think there's quite enough artifacts for it to be main deckable, but you probably could main deck it because it is such a blowout when it works, and it is going to be a potent sideboard card regardless. So I don't know how high of a pick it's going to be. I'm going to have to see exactly how many of the artifact creatures get played and how many decks end up playing artifact creatures. But I'm going to start off with taking it like kind of middle to end of the pack when I'm playing in a sideboard games, because you don't generally prioritize sideboard cards as highly, but it will be a card I'll be happy to have in the sideboard. Next up is Moth Rider Patrol. It's a 1/1 flyer for 1, which isn't good enough stats on its own, but it does have the ability to tap creatures. And I still don't think that really gets there. 4 mana is a lot of mana for that sort of ability. Even when it gets like 3 mana, it does get a little bit excessive. Where I could see this card having a home is if you have some ninja synergies in a white-blue or white-black deck. And in this case, Moth Rider Patrol is a pretty good enabler for your ninjas. The way the ninjutsu mechanic works is when you can return an unblocked creature to your hand and then put your ninja into play for its cheaper, often cheaper, sometimes not cheaper, ninjutsu cost. And so with Moth Rider Patrol, you're going to be able to have a cheap evasive creature to enable those ninjas. So in some decks, maybe ninjas aren't just a blue-black thing in this set. Maybe you can play your ninjas in other color combinations. So maybe you have a white-blue ninjas deck or a white-black ninjas deck, and then you can get your Moth Rider Patrol going and have a great enabler for a ninjas deck. But outside of that, I don't think I'd play it, and so I don't think it's a high priority because it doesn't have a lot of flexibility, but it is pretty good if you are trying to enable ninjas. Next up is Regent's Authority. This one I'm going to have to read again. It's got a lot of text, but it's like a combat trick, but it works especially well for enchantment creatures, essentially. Yeah, that's what it does. +2/+2 for 1 mana is generally just like standard fare for combat tricks, not a high priority. Leaving behind a counter means it could be a little bit better in some decks, but that doesn't mean you're going to have to take it earlier, I don't think. It just means that of the times where you end up with it in your pile, you'll probably play it slightly more in those decks. Not a high priority, but a solid card if you need a combat trick. Next up is Repel the Vile. This sort of card doesn't often see play when it's just the destroy a creature with power 4 or greater, but because it can also exile an enchantment, and there are some pretty big enchantments or enchantment creatures running around, I think this card could have a home in the format. It's not a premium card because 4 mana is a lot for this sort of effect, but I think it's certainly playable, and that means that if you get one in the draft, you're not going to prioritize it, but if you get one, you can probably play it. Next is Seven Tail Mentor. I actually think this card looks pretty good because it plays so well with the modified theme. It's not a card you're going to have to prioritize, partly because it's like just not super powerful stats wise, and also partly because 4-drops aren't cards you generally have to prioritize. But I think Seven Tail Mentor does look like pretty solid if you care about modifying your creatures, and like a 3/4 worth of stats that then can give you stats when it dies a little bit as well. Maybe you want to spread out the counters, so you put a counter on another creature. We've seen this sort of effect before where a creature enters and puts 2 counters. This one kind of gets 1 when you enter, 1 when it leaves. So overall, I think it's going to be a solid card, but again, not a high priority pick. Next up is Spirited Companion. This card has a lot of potential. It looks really good for decks that care about having a lot of enchantments. It looks good for decks that have a lot of like modified stuff, like especially equipments to put onto creatures. Because if you're going to be able to equip this, then if you have a good equipment, you just want to have bodies to put that equipment on. And so Spirited Companion does play pretty well in that situation. Overall, though, not super high impact, even though it does replace itself. So it's never going to be like abysmally bad. It's always going to be like at the very least solid. different decks, it might not do a lot. So I think this card might be like a decently high pick, like a card that you kind of hope to enable, because if it is good in your deck, then it might be like a very good card in your deck, or a card that you're actively happy to see every time. But in some decks, it's just going to be like, okay, I played a Spirited Companion. It didn't do all that much, but definitely a card that I'm going to be keeping my eye on, and I think it definitely has a lot of potential. Next is Sunblade Samurai, a card that does suffer a little bit from the 5-drop problem, where a 5-drop isn't just a card that you just like really care about taking super aggressively, but this one does look like it's nice because of the channel ability, so you can get a land from your deck and gain some life. While if you don't have the ability to play this early, it's an enchantment creature, which is nice for some enchantment synergies, but it can also be a downside because if there's enchantment removal spells, they can kill this guy, and oftentimes those spells are going to be a little bit cheaper, so you might get your Sunblade Samurai killed a little bit easier. 5 mana 4/4 isn't the best stat, but I think holistically as a whole the card is like solid, so it's like a fine card to play, though I'm not going to prioritize it while I'm drafting. It's probably just like if I pick up one in the middle of the pack, it'll be fine, but not like a card I'm going to be like aggressively going after. Next up is Wanderer's Intervention. This is pretty typical white removal, but it's not like great white removal. Generally, your aggressive decks aren't super interested in this sort of effect because the opponent's creature still gets to block and absorb some damage, even if you are getting to use your removal spell. Sometimes it's also pretty obvious when you have this sort of card, so your opponent can play around it. But 2 mana to deal 4 damage to a creature can still get the job done, and so it's playable. It's just not a card I would prioritize. Next up is the blue cards, starting off with Armguard Familiar. This is the first time we've seen the reconfigure mechanic. This is a pretty cool mechanic. It lets you use your creatures as equipments, which is really powerful, and I think that a lot of the reconfigure cards are pretty good as a result. 2 mana for a 2/1 artifact creature with Ward 2. Like Ward 2, because they're not really going to be using removal on it, isn't like the greatest, but it's overall going to be pretty reasonable, I think. And then the fact that you can equip it to your other creatures, protect them, get a little extra power, seems pretty good to me. So I think Armguard Familiar is probably a premium 2-drop in blue, one of the cards you're going to want to prioritize if you are playing blue, and one that I wouldn't mind taking a little bit early because it does have good synergies with other blue decks, and Reconfigure seems like a good mechanic. Just maybe Reconfigure is not as good as I think. 4 mana is a lot for the equipping ability, but I think being able to turn your creatures into equipments makes you just have so much flexibility with how you use your mana and things like that. And like it goes back to being a creature if they do end up killing your creature that was equipped. Next up is Disruption Protocol. It's a counterspell, but you have to have a creature, or you can pay an extra one, so it's cancel with a little bit of extra upside. I'm not a huge fan of this card, partly because I think a lot of the big mechanics in this set really just punish counterspells. So because Ninjutsu is an activated ability and because Channel is an activated ability, Disruption Protocol doesn't counter those, which means that it's just going to be like if you hold up mana for a counterspell and then your opponent like taps out to do a Channel ability or taps out to Ninjutsu their creature in, you aren't going to get to counter it, which really just punishes you. So I think it's going to be a niche card that doesn't really see a lot of play as a result, though it does have some powerful applications. So I'm not really high on the card. I don't think I'm going to prioritize taking it. I don't think I'm going to play it. And so I don't think it's a very good card in the format, but it is a pretty cool design. It would be a good card in different formats, I think, just not this one. Next up is Futurist Sentinel. This one has a pretty high crew cost of 3, but it does attack as a 6/6 and it is only 4 mana. This card looks like it has some synergy with some of the cards that are available in white decks specifically that let your creatures crew as if they add higher power than they actually do. So they might make a 1/1 that can crew as though its power were 2 greater, which means you can crew the Futurist Sentinel a little bit easier. I don't think it's super good if you're not playing a vehicles strategy though, because if you aren't, then you won't necessarily have these creatures that are meant for crewing, and it'll be hard to get use out of this. You also want to be aggressive with this because tapping one of your 3-powered creatures, that 3-powered creature was probably already good on blocks, and so this one, is more of an aggressive threat, and so we'll just have to see which blue decks care about it, but it might be interesting for the blue-white vehicles deck, though again, it's so inflexible that it's not really a priority for that deck. It's not a card that you can really fit into multiple strategies as easily, so you can probably just get these later. Next is Guardians of Oboro. A 3 mana 3/4 is pretty good as a defensive card in your deck, and then if you do manage to modify it, you can attack with it, which is pretty nice. So if you have some reconfigure cards, this card could be pretty nice, even if you aren't just playing a dedicated control deck. I think this card is just like rock solid. It's not a insane card, but in the right deck, it could actually be pretty nice because a 3 mana 3/4 holds the ground really well if you're trying to do late game shenanigans, and eventually it can be able to attack. So I think this card's pretty good. I wouldn't mind picking it in like the middle of the pack. I think you might actually have to prioritize this card slightly, depending on what blue tries to do. Having 3 power also means it crews vehicles decently well, because even though it does have Defender, you can still crew vehicles with it. So keep that in mind. I don't think this card's going to be the sort of card that you just get like 10th pick all the time. So you might have to like take it a little bit higher than that. You might have to prioritize it when you see it. a little bit, like get it like 5th or 6th pick. But I think the card looks like it could be pretty reasonable, and definitely one I'm excited to try out. I think it looks like a solid card. Next is Mirror Shell Crab, a card that I'm very excited to play. I just think it's a very cool design. So it's a 7 mana 5/7 artifact creature. So it gets would get slightly punished by artifact removal, except it has Ward 3. So it's really hard to deal with once it hits the battlefield. It's generally not going to like trade down on mana too hard, even if at all. And then it has a channel ability where you can counter a spell or ability unless its controller pays 3. Which means that it can counter channel abilities. So the problem with the counter spell we saw earlier was that it couldn't counter channel abilities, and this one can, which is really quite nice. And so I think Mirror Shell Crab is going to be a pretty good card. It just gives your blue deck a great late game while also not being like dead in the mid game or early game. And so overall, I think Mirror Shell Crab is going to be a card that if you have like 3 of them in your deck, you can maybe like build your deck slightly differently because you're going to be able to jam these in the late game. It remains to be seen whether you're going to need late game stuff if you are just like reconfiguring or doing other late game engines, but you probably will because it's limited. You're going to want something to do in the late game, and Mirror Shell Crab looks pretty sweet. It is a 7-drop, so I'm not like but it does have like the 3 mana counter spell mode, and so I'm not really sure exactly how highly you want to take it. Also, it's kind of funny that by the time that stopping them from paying counter unless they pay 3 would be dead, you get to just jam your 7-drop anyway, so that's pretty nice. But I think the card's actually going to be pretty good, and I wouldn't mind having like 2 copies in a deck, I feel like, which means that you might have to take it like 6th pick or 7th pick instead of like trying to get them super late, which is pretty cool for this sort of card. I don't know if I would like want to pick it in my first like 3 or 4 picks. I don't know if it's that strong, but it does seem like a cool card, and I'm really excited to try it out. But yeah, definitely a good card, and one that you'll probably see a decent amount of. Next is Mnemonic Sphere. So it's 2 mana, and you kind of have to pay an extra 2 mana after that to draw 2 cards. So like 4 mana, draw 2, or it's 1 mana, draw 1. It's an artifact for other synergies that you care about with artifacts, and overall, I think the card's just solid. It's not like anything too crazy. Paying 2 mana and 2 mana in installments is a little bit better than just straight up paying 4. The fact that you can discard it to draw a card when you need to is really nice. If you have some artifact synergies, maybe it's a little bit better as well. Just not a card that you'll have to prioritize, I don't think. I don't think it's going to be like taking over games or anything like that. It just is a nice option to have, and one that you can like put into your deck, but not going to be a priority and not really going to be a high pick at all, I don't think. Next is the Modern Age. It is a saga. The first 2 steps, you draw a card and discard a card, so you loot, so you get to filter through your deck, and then at the end, you get a 2/3 flyer. So 2 mana for a 2/3 flyer, plus a couple of loots. Again, I don't think it's as good as like an aggressive card, because you kind of take turn 2 off if you're casting this on turn 2 and you want to be attacking them. But in like if you're playing a mid-rangey deck, like in the mid game, if you're just holding your extra lands, you draw this, so you're like have 5, like you have a land in hand and you have like 5 lands in play or whatever. You play this thing, you get to draw a card, discard a card, so get rid of the lands. You start filtering through your lands, and then you end up with a 2/3 flyer. I think this card's very good, and I think it's going to be a high pick as a result. Maybe one of the better blue commons, and definitely a great card, I think. So you don't think you want to play it in your aggressive decks, but it's definitely good in like mid-rangey or control decks, I think. Next is Moon Circuit Hacker. So this is the first card we're seeing with ninjutsu. So we'll get to like look at that mechanic. I have mentioned it before. It is also worth noting that it is an enchantment creature. So 2 mana, 2/1, but when it does combat damage, you draw a card, and if you do, discard a card, unless it enters the battlefield this turn. So when you ninjutsu it in, you get to draw a card, and every turn after that it loots, or if you just play it as your 2-drop, you just get to loot with it. And looting is quite powerful and limited. It gives you card selection, it helps you get rid of excess lands, and in that case it's oftentimes as good as drawing a card if you're getting rid of extra lands. And when you are using the Moon Circuit Hacker, if you can ninjutsu it in, you get a pretty decent payoff, though I think it's just going to be good for any blue deck. Blue looks like it has a couple of good 2-drops this time around. We already saw the Reconfigure one, now we're seeing this one. It also does reward you for having like cheap evasive creatures, as we saw earlier, because the ninjutsu cost is pretty cheap. So overall, a pretty good card, and one you might have to prioritize because it looks pretty good, especially coming down on turn 2 and having both enchantment synergies and ninja synergies. Next is Moonfolk Puzzlemaker. So it's a 3 mana 1/4 artifact creatures with flying. So overall, not the best stats. And when it becomes tapped, you scry 1. So I'm not super optimistic on this card. The stat line just isn't really there. And even though it's like an artifact, and it might have some synergies with just tapping in non-combat ways to crew vehicles or things like that, 1 power means it's not going to crew vehicles especially well. And so that means that you're not getting a ton of upside out of this. So I think Moonfolk Puzzlemaker is a little bit weak. Not a card you're going to prioritize or probably play all that often. Next is Moonsnare Prototype, a card that ironically plays pretty well with the Moonsnare Puzzlemaker that we just saw, but generally this card's going to be played for the channel mode, I think. 5 mana to basically put your opponent's creature into their deck, so it trades 1-for-1 with their creature, even if they are going to get to redraw it if they so choose. And then other than that, you can use the mana mode if you have a specific hand for it, or you have artifact synergies or things of that nature. So in the right shell, it could be really good, and outside of a specific deck, I think it's going to mostly just be a 5 mana, like put a creature into their deck, which is kind of decent removal for blue. It's kind of like the low end of playable blue removal, and has some extra upside in being an artifact. So I think overall that recipe leads to a solid card overall, and one that if you are in an artifact deck, you might actually have to prioritize decently highly, because other decks can snipe it from you to use the channel mode if they need interaction. Next is Moonsnare Specialist, another pretty cool ninja. And also worth noting that you'll get the ability of this ninja if it isn't entering from ninjutsu as well. But when it enters, you return a creature to its owner's hand. This can be your creature. Oftentimes it's going to be theirs. And so if you do ninjutsu this in, you're going to get a decent tempo advantage. So if you get your like early evasive creature, and then you can hit with this, you can play like a 3-mana bounce their creature. So like it's a mana war in the right situation. And other than that, it's like a 4-mana mana war, which is still playable. We've seen versions of that in the past that have been pretty solid. And so Moonsnare Specialist also strikes me as a pretty good card. It is a 4-drop if you aren't doing the ninjutsu thing. So unless you're in like a ninja's deck or where you're prioritizing cheap evasive creatures, then I don't think it's going to like really be a great card, like a card that you take super highly, but you'll still play it outside of that. So it has a little bit of flexibility, which means that taking a little bit earlier in the pack and then hoping to high roll into ninjas and then just being fine playing a copy outside of that seems like a reasonable thing to do. So I think this card looks pretty good to me. Next is Network Disruptor. This looks like the sort of card that you'll only really play in a dedicated ninjas deck. And so I don't think it's a high priority until you're in the ninjas deck. So once, like early on in pack 1, you're not going to take this card really, unless you have like a really good ninjas payoff. But once you know you're in ninjas, you'll be pretty happy to get a few of these cards, because it really does enable ninjas quite well. And it also works well with ninjas because on if you play it on turn 1, you get to start like getting your ninjas in by it being an evasive creature. But then when you play it later in the game, you tap your opponent's creature so that your ninjas that you've already played can hit their opponent still. So it makes blocking really hard for your opponent, not only because it is evasive, but also because it like continues to make it so that your ninjas can hit your opponent and get whatever combat damage abilities they have. So I think it's a good card for ninjas, not really playable outside of that, which means you don't have to prioritize it unless you're in ninjas, in which case you can get it a little bit later because other drafters aren't interested. Next is Planar Incision. It is kind of like a reprint of a card that we saw in Dominaria. I think it was Dominaria, Teferi's Protection or something, or Teferi's something or other. But it's like exile your creature, put it back into play. This one, it comes back with a counter. Unless you have cards with enters the battlefield abilities, and quite a few of them, I wouldn't really play this as just a way to stop your opponent's removal spells or as a weird combat trick, because it is just kind of a finicky card to use. But if you do have enough synergies, it can be playable. But again, not a huge priority. I expect to see this card very late in the pack quite often, because it's kind of hard to find room for this sort of marginal effect in your deck. Next is Saiba Trespassers. So it's a 5-mana 3/5 artifact creature, which is decent stats, but not great. But it also has the ability to tap a couple of your opponent's creatures with its channel ability. And because you can use channel at instant speed, you can kind of shut down your opponent from attacking you for a couple turns, though you are putting yourself down a card to do so. I'm not a huge fan of this. 5 mana is expensive, and 4 mana for its other ability is expensive. And overall, I think you can probably find better options. If you do have to play it, it's not the end of the world, but it's just not a great card. And so you don't really want to prioritize this when you are drafting. Next is Short Circuit. We've seen this sort of effect before. It's never been particularly good. The fact that it takes away flying is also not super relevant, because hopefully you're shrinking a creature down so it'll have no power, and so all it's going to be doing is blocking anyway. I'm not really optimistic about this card though, because I've just seen it enough times in the past to know that it doesn't really do a ton. It doesn't always do what you want to do. If they have like a big creature, it's not really going to fully deal with it. And you don't really want to like have your removal slots in your deck not able to like deal with any creature you come against. So not a huge fan of this card. I don't think you're going to really be playing it all that often, though you can play it in a pinch. I don't think you have to prioritize it in the draft phase. Next is Sky Swimmer Koi. We've been seeing 4-mana 3/3 flyers with upside for the past few sets now, and this one looks like it's pretty solid. Being able to loot whenever you play an artifact is pretty good. It's going to depend on how many artifacts you have. I think 4-mana 3/3 flyer is good if you're being aggressive, because having evasion is important for aggressive decks. If you're defensive, though, it still blocks as a 3/3 for 4 mana, so you're not going to necessarily want it as much in your defensive decks. So it's a little bit narrower in that sense, and also you are going to want to have artifacts to trigger it. So I think that it's going to be fine in any deck, but you really are only going to be like, and it's also suffers from the 4-drop problem. So I think it's going to be solid in any deck, kind of solid plus in certain decks, and solid minus in other decks. It's never going to be like a terrible card to put into play, but I think oftentimes 4-drops are just like disposable. So you can just get which you can, it doesn't really matter necessarily which 4-drop you get, you'll end up with some. And so I think Sky Swimmer Course suffers from that a little bit. And so it's not going to be a high priority pick, even though it'll probably perform well when it is in play. You just don't have to like care necessarily which 4-drop you get. And this one doesn't seem like essential for a strategy, though it does seem like a solid card. Like, don't get me wrong, the card is still solid and probably, yeah, a card that you'll be relatively happy playing. Next is Spell Pierce. This card isn't like particularly great in draft a lot of the time because most of draft is creatures, but it's a fine sideboard card if your opponent has especially like big instants or sorceries, or maybe enchantments in this case that you really have to deal with. But I wouldn't start by main decking it just because most of limited is creatures, and this card is not that flexible. And even if you do line it up against your opponent's enchantment, oftentimes they'll be able to pay the 2. So I think it's more of a sideboard card, and even then not a really good sideboard card, so I wouldn't prioritize it even then. It also suffers from the fact that a lot of the cards are channel, so the same weakness of the other counter spells we looked at. Next is Suit Up. This one is kind of an interesting take on a blue combat trick. The fact that it replaces itself is very nice. Buffing a creature up to a 4/5 is also pretty nice. It's one of those things that's interesting where in a lot of sets, this card wouldn't necessarily be good because you don't like really care about like pushing damage or doing things like that with blue decks. But in a deck where you have ninja synergies, where your opponent is incentivized to block your creatures just to stop you from getting ninjas into play, you can just attack with like your 2/2 and they block with their 4/4, and then you get to play this card and really get them. So I think this card's going to be really good in a ninjas deck, or a deck that can threaten to have ninjas, like a color combination that would have a lot of ninjas. So blue itself has ninjas, but if you compare it with another deck, like another color that has ninjas in it, you can potentially really wreck your opponents with Suit Up. So I think it's good in a ninjas deck and not really good outside of it, just because it is a little bit clunky and not necessarily what blue's interested in terms of being a combat trick. Though replacing itself is super good, so you can get a really big blowout with this card. I just think it's mostly going to be a good card to get for your ninjas and not really outside of that. So I'm not going to really start by prioritizing it. Next is Tameo's Completion. This is blue's version of removal. It's pretty similar to other blue removal spells we've seen in the past. They usually end up being solid but not exceptional, and this doesn't really look like anything different from that. The fact that it can like be used on equipments is nice, and loses all its abilities is nice. But overall, I think it's just going to be a slightly better version of Capture Sphere, and that card was fine. This card's going to probably be fine plus. And so just a solid card, but nothing like, it's just a fine card, but not a huge priority or thing in the draft. Though if you need some removal, you might bump it up a little in your priority order once you're later on in the draft. Next is starting with the black cards. Chainflail Centipede. This is another reconfigure card. 3 mana 2/2 for an artifact creature is not necessarily the best stat line, but the fact that it can give your other creatures +2/+0 on their attack phase for only 2 mana is pretty nice, especially because the way that reconfigure works is you can equip it to like your 1/1, say. Let's just say it was a 2/2 because 2/2s are way more common and limited. You equip this to your 2/2, it attacks as a 4/2, and your opponent trades with it. Then the equipment falls off and this becomes a 2/2 again, so you can block with it still and things like that. So even though it's only useful on attacks, it's also like pretty reasonable to expect your opponent might trade with that creature. I don't think it's a high pick just because a 3 mana 2/2 is kind of low stats. But if you care about modifying your creatures, which a decent amount of black decks might care about doing because modified is pretty rampant in black, you might prioritize this card a little bit more just so that you can start equipping your creatures, get those modified synergies going. But if the fact that it doesn't do anything when you're on defense really does ding it in my opinion. So I don't think it's a high pick early in the draft, but once you know what your strategy is, you might prioritize it a little bit higher. Next is Clawing Torment. This is a weird card. Giving a creature -1/-1 for 1 mana it just isn't really that impactful. The fact that the creature can't block means that it could be an okay card if you're a hyper-aggressive deck. And the fact that the opponent's going to start losing life over time if the creature doesn't die immediately is also a factor. But I think generally this is going to be a card you don't prioritize. And then once you're an aggressive deck, you can maybe get these on like the wheel, and like you might play 1 copy or sideboard it in if you see some 1 toughness creatures. It just doesn't seem that impactful for me. So even though it's got a lot of text, it just doesn't seem like it's going to have a big enough impact in a lot of limited games to be worth playing, especially if you're a more defensive deck, because then making the creature unable to block doesn't really do anything. So it's like narrow and not particularly powerful, so it's going to have a very limited place where it's going to find a home. Next is Debt to the Kami. This is a pretty cool card if you're playing against a deck that has enchantment creatures, because they'll have to exile a creature and then exile an enchantment. If they have an enchantment creature, they get to exile the creature first. They get to exile the enchantment creature as a creature, so you're not going to get to bag 2 of their guys. Oh, I guess you only get to choose 1 anyway. I thought it was choose 1 or both. So yeah, I guess reading the card explains the card, as they say, but just not a super powerful effect. Your opponent's going to be able to have multiple creatures in play. They might have multiple enchantment creatures in play, and this sort of effect is just too slow to be good, so I wouldn't recommend playing it, and I'm not going to be prioritizing it or taking it really in the draft, so if I end up with one, I'm not going to play it probably. And yeah, unless I run short on playables, which hopefully isn't going to happen because there's a lot of good playable cards. So yeah, just don't play this card. Next is Dakuchi Shadow Walker. It is 6 mana 5/5, so not great stats on that baseline, but it does have ninjutsu. So if you can get it into play, it's a 4 mana 5/5. So 4 mana 5/5 is great, 6 mana 5/5 is not good. So that means you're only going to want to play this card in your dedicated ninja deck. And so that makes it a very narrow card. It's not even particularly powerful in those decks because you still kind of have to have things line up properly for it. And so I would just pretty much steer clear of this card unless you're in a ninjas deck. And even then, I wouldn't prioritize it. You might be able to get it on the wheel if you really care about it, or things of that nature, but you shouldn't be really caring about this. If you get one and you have to play it, it's fine in a dedicated ninjas deck, but it's not even a card that even in a ninjas deck I would be happy playing, so I don't think you're going to want to prioritize it. Next is Inkrise Infiltrator. This could be a very good card for the ninjas deck because, as we talked about earlier, cheap evasive creatures are really good. So 2 mana, 1/2 flyer might already be good enough for the ninjas deck just because it lets you get in and hit your opponents unblocked so you can get your ninjas into play. And the fact that it has an extra ability for the late game situations is actually pretty relevant because once you're hitting them for 3 a turn with your flyer, the game does end relatively quickly. So it's got decent abilities early, decent abilities late, but I wouldn't play it outside of a dedicated ninjas deck because you really have to care about a 1/2 flyer being relevant for getting your ninjas into play. And a lot of color combinations aren't going to really care about that. So only really play it in your blue-black ninjas decks, I think, but it's fine there. But that doesn't make it a high pick or anything in the draft phase. Next is Kaito's Pursuit. I think this card is a pretty sweet design because it really helps your ninjas punch through, which is one of their weaknesses. Once they're in play, they're often weaker creatures. So they're like a 2/1 or a 3/2. And so your opponent can just like block them. But this gives you an effect that is already like marginally playable and limited, and then also makes it fine with your ninjas. So if you have enough ninjas in your deck, you can play this card. I don't think I would play it if I had no ninja synergies. I might sideboard it in the right situation or play it in like sealed or something. But I wouldn't main deck this in draft if I didn't have ninjas. But if I had like enough ninjas, I might consider it if I was a little bit short on playables because the effect is still generally a little bit slow for limited, but in the right deck, in the right build, it can be fine. But not a high priority pick because it's such a narrow use case. Next is Kami of Restless Shadows, 5 mana 3/3, so weak stats and a 5-drop, so it's already not really a high priority for me. When it enters the battlefield, though, you get to return a ninja or rogue to your hand, which is nice because that's like pure value. So if you're playing a blue-black ninjas deck, you can get some value there. Or you can put a creature on top of your library, which isn't really worth doing for a 5 mana 3/3. So I'm not going to really prioritize this card at all. If I get a copy and I'm playing ninjas, I might play it, but I'm not going to like take it or prioritize it in any way during the draft. Next is Kami of Terrible Secrets, a payoff for having an enchantment and an artifact in play, which is one of the themes in this set, especially in the white-black color combination. And if you can do that, then you get to draw a card and gain a life, which is quite powerful, attached to a 4 mana 3/4. The problem is that on turn 4, it's pretty unlikely that you're going to be able to have curved an artifact into an enchantment. That's not going to happen all that often. So you might have one of the types, but you might just not, even if you have both in your deck, you might not have drawn exactly one of each. So it's only really drawing you a card in the late game, and a 4 mana 3/4 with no text isn't good. It's not an artifact creature or an enchantment creature itself. And so I don't think Kami of Terrible Secrets is a particularly good card. Though if you get one in your dedicated enchantments and artifact deck, then it's a fine one to include. But being a 4-drop, being pretty narrow, being only usable in one archetype really means that I'm probably not going to prioritize it, and I don't think it's going to be a hard card to get a hold of if you do really like kind of want one for your deck. So not really a high pick in the draft. Next is Lethal Exploit, a card that is interesting to consider. I think it's only going to be good in your modified decks because 2 mana for -2/-2 at instant speed isn't good enough on its own. But if you're giving 2 mana for -3/-3, that's actually a good card. The extra -1/-1 is pretty relevant there. And so I think that if you have a decent amount of modified in your deck, this becomes a high pick. It might even be worth taking a little bit earlier in the draft because it doesn't seem all that difficult to get some modified into your deck to get this to be -3/-3. And it does scale with the game decently well. So overall, I think Lethal Exploit does have good potential, but is not a card that is necessarily going to play out great. But I think I would start out by thinking it's going to be solid and that you're going to be able to get some modified stuff in your deck. And in that case, it's going to end up doing like solid work. So I think it could be a pretty good removal spell, but not a card that I'm like overly prioritizing in the draft, unless I already have some good modified synergies. Next is Mukotai Ambusher. I don't know why I always pronounce those words with an accent. Mukotai. It just sounds so epic. But yeah, it's an artifact creature, so that's relevant. 4 mana for a 3/2 lifelink is like not even like horrific. That's like it's not a good card. It's kind of like a barely like it's a playable card, but begrudgingly playable. The fact that you can get this into play on turn like for only 2 mana with ninjutsu is pretty good though, because like it's a big life swing. You get a nice body that's going to have to be dealt with, and it's an artifact creature for those synergies. So I think the card's actually pretty good in your ninja's deck and not good outside of it, which is a pretty cool recipe because it means that your ninja deck is going to be able to gain access to this sort of card. And it's not an abysmal card if you only have like a couple of like ways to maybe potentially sneak it through. Next is Nezumi Blade Blesser. And again, I don't think it's a particularly high priority pick because it's kind of narrow. Next is Nezumi Blade Blesser, another card that cares about you having an enchantment and an artifact. I think getting Death Touch is way more important. Death Touch is really brutal because it's good on offense or defense, and it's just a great mechanic. So you'd rather have the artifact mode of the card, but it's especially good if you can get both, because Menace and Death Touch means that if your opponent does double block, you're going to get a 2-for-1 with your guy. So I don't think it's a high priority. 3 mana 3/2, that's kind of hard to enable in some cases, isn't like the best. But if you're going to consistently have an artifact in play, especially, then the card's actually going to be pretty good in your deck, and so is worth taking a little bit higher in that case. But if it's a 3-drop, 3-drops are a little bit more easy to find, like decent 3-drops than decent 2-drops and stuff. Next up is Okiba Reckoner Raid. This one's really an interesting design. So basically the first 2 turns, you're going to make your opponent lose life and you gain a life, so drain them for 1. So it's going to deal 2 damage to them, you're going to gain 2 life, and then it's going to be a 2/2 menace that gives vehicles you control menace. So I think it's a pretty cool design, and it only costs 1 mana to cast on the front side of the card, which I think is actually pretty powerful if you're an aggressive deck that cares about your opponent losing life. And also could be used to enable some of those enchantment synergies that we've seen, where it's like it cares about you having an enchantment in play. Well, you have this saga in play, and it flips into an enchantment creature. So if you play this on turn 1, then maybe it's easier to enable your 4 mana 3/4 or things of that nature. And so for that reason, I think Okiba Reckoner Raid is actually going to be a pretty solid card in the format. It's just only paying 1 mana for it, and the fact that you're going to get a 2/2 out of it eventually is pretty nice. And so it just seems like a good card to me. I think it's going to be a pretty high pick, even for pretty much any deck, just because the upside of playing this on turn 1 means that you're just going to be getting a 1 mana 2/2 menace that just like randomly buffs your vehicles and is an enchantment for your synergy. So the card just looks great to me, and I'm really excited to try it out. Next up, and it's going to be heavily competed for because I think a lot of decks are going to care about having early enchantment creatures and things like that. And even playing into the mid game, you're getting a little bit of value. It's not as good, but it's a 1-drop, so you're just getting so much like good equity if you draw it in your opening hand. Next is Reckoner Shakedown. Not a good card. 3 mana to look at their hand just isn't good, and putting 2 counters on your creature also isn't good at sorcery speed. And so overall, not a card I'm going to be like taking highly or playing at all. I'm not going to play this card, and I don't think you should play it either. So it doesn't even matter when you would get it in the draft because you're not going to play it. Next is Reckoner's Bargain. This is a card that's sometimes playable if you have some like creatures that are like coming with tokens, or some cards that are like disposable, or as a sideboard card if your opponent does play a removal spell like the enchantment removal spell that we've seen, that the Tamiyo's Completion card. Being able to have something to sacrifice can be nice. But the fact that you can also sacrifice an artifact can be relevant because there's potentially some synergies with that, or artifacts that care about going to the graveyard. But it's more of a narrow card that you're not going to prioritize during the drafting phase. And so I think you can get a little bit later in the draft if you are interested, and it's not a card you're going to play all that often. Next is Return to Action. It's an interesting card. We've seen a variant on the past of this effect in the past that gave +1/+0 and gave indestructible until end of turn. But this shouldn't makes it leave play and then come back to the battlefield under the owner's control, so you can like get enters the battlefield effects again, which is pretty nice. So I think it's even a little bit better than that other effect would have been. So Return to Action is like a fine combat trick, but not a high priority, and it's worth playing if you like need a combat trick and have enters the battlefield effects. But generally, because it's only giving +1/+0, it's not going to be like a super good card. So not a card you're going to play all that often, but when you do need some extra juice, it's not going to do like nothing for you when you put it in your deck. It's generally going to do something that contributes to you winning the game, just not the best card. So basically adding up to not a priority in the draft phase, and not a card that's always going to make the cut in your deck. Next is Twisted Embrace. This is probably the best black common. It just seems absolutely fantastic. 4 mana, you get to put it on one of your creatures, give it +1/+1, and you get to destroy a creature your opponent controls. So it's triggering your modified stuff, it's an enchantment for those synergies, and it kills your opponent's creature, all for the low cost of 4 mana. And +1/+1 on your creature, even like it's just like nice to have, even if you have no modified synergies whatsoever. So looks like a fantastic card. You'll play as many of these as you can get. It's good in any deck. You do want to make sure you have creatures, but limited decks all have creatures, and so this is going to be just a good card for your deck, and you should be playing these. Looks fantastic, and it's going to be contested, so you're going to have to take these early. Next is Undercity Scrounger, another card that actually looks pretty nice. 3 mana for a 1/4 artifact creature isn't like the greatest, but the fact that it can start making treasures if you have creatures dying does have some synergy in this set. There are some decks that care about like sacrificing artifacts or using artifacts to do other things, and so being able to make treasure tokens that you kind of don't mind sacrificing to other effects is pretty nice. And so I think Undercity Scrounger is going to have a nice home in those decks. It is weak in a lot of decks that don't care about like having a defensive 1/4 or artifact creatures or having artifacts. So it's more narrow, so I don't think you have to take it early or anything, but it is going to be good in a narrow range of decks. So in some decks, you're going to be pretty happy to have it, and in most decks, you won't, which means if you do want it, you'll probably be able to get it. Next is a Virus Beetle. This is a card that I really like the design of. It's a cheap artifact creature. It's a card that it isn't like evasive for your ninjas, but it does play well with ninjas, because if you can return it to your hand by ninjaing it, you get to then play it again and make them discard another card. So it's like a high roll upside for your ninja cards, and it's a sort of card that's also really good if you have cards like that one we looked at earlier, the 3 mana one that gives you turns a creature into a 4/5 and draws a card, because your opponent's going to want to block the Virus Beetle just to avoid the possibility of you ninjaing in a ninja. And so if you have cards that punish your opponent for blocking or punish your opponent if their creature has taken damage, then the Virus Beetle plays really well with that. And also as like an artifact creature, it can have synergies with that, and it does also just make your opponent discard a card for a relatively low cost and as a creature. So I think the card's going to play out pretty good in the format. And yeah, it's kind of like the inverse of the enchantment dog creature we looked at earlier. I think it's going to be a pretty solid card. Next is You Are Already Dead. This is a card that plays really well with the Virus Beetle. It destroys a creature that was dealt damage this turn and draws a card. So it can get you a nice, like, if you like suicided in a creature, you get that card back by drawing a card, and you also destroy the creature that it suicided against. It basically is like give your creature death touch almost in many cases, or if you have some way to ping creatures, it can do good stuff with that. Overall, the card seems pretty solid to me. If you are in the right deck, it worked pretty well with ninjas stuff, because ninjas are like gonna make your opponent want to block more often, especially because ninjas are pretty small. So it's like you're trading your 2/1 for their 4/4 or things like that. So it could be really good in a ninjas deck or in a deck that has other small like dinky creatures. So it could have a nice fit for the format. So we'll have to see how it ends up playing out. But I think the card it's not going to be like the highest of picks, but if you end up with a couple copies in your deck, I think it'll like grease the wheels pretty nicely. And so I think it's fine to have like a couple copies in your deck. And so taking it like 6th or 7th, maybe the middle of the pack range could be fine for your deck. Though you do need to make sure that you have ways to like use the card. So make sure you have creatures in your deck, basically. Especially like small dinky creatures like the 1/1 Virus Beetle are especially good with this sort of card. But it's just going to be fine in any creature deck. It just basically makes your creatures trade for whatever. It's like Blade Brand, but costing 1 mana in many cases without the downside of your creature getting blown out. So it's like a better version of Blade Brand, and Blade Brand was always pretty solid. Moving on to the red cards, starting off with Aki Emberkeeper. This one, 2 mana, 1/2/1 for an enchantment creature, so it has some synergies there. And then when your modified creatures die, you get 1/1 spirits. So I don't think it's going to be like generating you tons of spirits, but even if it only generates you 1 spirit over the course of the game, it's still a pretty good card. And if in your dedicated modified deck, if it's spitting out a token every time one of your creatures dies, that's pretty strong. And so I think Aki Emberkeeper is going to be a decently high pick just because it's a 2-drop. 2-drops are really important to have, and a 2-drop that has like some nice relevance over the course of the game is pretty good. Because even if it only counts your non-token creatures dying, you can still put equipment onto your 1/1 spirit creature tokens, and those creatures are potentially going to trade with your opponent's creatures then. So Aki Emberkeeper looks like it has a lot of potential in that sort of deck. So probably a pretty like decently high pick, so picking like 4th or 5th maybe in the draft, because you do need to get those 2-drops locked up. Next is Aki Ronin, another 2-drop. It's a 1/3, so it doesn't attack particularly well. But whenever a samurai warrior attacks alone, you can discard a card, and if you do, draw a card. So it doesn't like do a ton of damage, but it does help you filter through your deck, which is pretty powerful. And it also filters through your deck if your other samurais are attacking. So it seems like a pretty good card for the samurai deck. It's decent on its own, though not great. And so overall, I think it's mostly going to be played in that samurai deck, but not really played that much outside of it, because it doesn't really do a ton of work on its own. It's just not going to be able to attack all that often on its own, but it can, if you're starting to be able to filter through your cards with your samurai deck, that can be pretty good, because aggro decks don't need their lands really after a certain point. Next is Aki Warpaint, a card that I'm not really expecting to see much play. It's just very low impact for 1 mana. It just opens you up to getting 2 for 1, and doesn't even give you +2/+2. It only buffs the toughness by 1, so the creature's often still going to trade in combat relatively easily. So not a high priority in draft. If you had an insane amount of modified synergies, maybe you'd play it. So maybe that's why it's in the card file. But I don't expect to be playing this card all that often. Next is Ambitious Assault. This is a pretty cool effect. +2/+0 for all of your creatures is something we see fairly frequently, but usually it doesn't replace itself. And if you can consistently have this card replacing itself, then you're really in business. So I think the card's actually like quite strong. It doesn't only work on attacks, which sometimes these sorts of cards do. And the fact that it's not that hard to have a modified creature in this set because of the number of equipments and auras and +1/+1 counters means that if you can enable it, it can do good work for you. And I think as a result, it goes from being like a card that you'll get like last pick and sometimes play to a card that you might have to pick around like 8th pick or something like that, or 7th or 8th. Like you're not necessarily always going to wheel this card because it is a pretty good card for an aggressive deck that's trying to finish the game, because it just makes like can push so much damage. It can push like 6 damage in a turn and replace itself. So I think it's a pretty nice improvement on a card type we've seen a lot. Next up is Crackling Emergence, one of the more complicated commons I've ever seen. It basically turns your land into a 3/3 that can attack immediately. So it's like a 3-mana 3/3 haste in some ways, that you then can't use that land for a while, but you can use the land if you want to just tap your 3/3 creature. So it's kind of odd. I think it's a pretty good card still. It has a lot of synergies in the set. It does count as a modified creature because it's a creature that has an enchantment on it. Even if that creature's a land, it's kind of weird how that lines up. And then you don't even lose the land if the creature would die. So like it's like a 3-mana 3/3 in many ways with haste. Or you can play it on turn 2 and just treat your creature as it's like a 2-mana mana dork almost. I think the card's pretty good. And ending verdict, I think the card is pretty good. Because you can always still tap the land for mana, and you also have the option of hitting them for 3, and it triggers your modified stuff at relatively low cost. And yeah, I think it's going to be a relatively high pick as a result. The card just looks real. It's really hard to like parse and make a comparison to another card, but I'm like thinking of it as like a 3-mana 3/3 haste or a 2-mana 3/3 like mana dork kind of. And the fact that the land like gets to stick around if it would be destroyed is really nice. So huge. I just think the card's really cool and a really, really wonky design, but I think it's pretty powerful. And I would not be surprised if this was like a very high pick. Like, yeah, if you're relatively happy taking like 4th pick or something, because it just seems like it does a lot of stuff. Next is Experimental Synthesizer. So it's a little bit of card advantage for red. And it also plays well with synergy pieces that sacrifice artifacts, which we've seen a little bit of, cards that sacrifice artifacts. And then it also has the ability to sacrifice itself, which is nice because it can then turn into like a format, like essentially like you paid the 1 mana and you replaced itself. You can play the card, so you can play lands off of it. And so in like the mid game, you play that, you get another card off of it, and then you sacrifice it and maybe play another card off of it, or you sacrifice it to a different effect and get another card off of it. It just seems like it's going to grease the wheels of certain strategies very well, while also being fine in other decks. So medium high pick, I think. Looks like it can perform decently in different strategies, but it's going to really find a home in very specific strategies, specifically the ones that want artifacts in play that they can sacrifice, or artifacts in play to enable other strategies. Thinking of like that Moon Snare prototype we saw earlier that like taps itself in another artifact. This could be a good candidate for that, though. Of course, you don't necessarily want to play this in the early turns because you want to make sure you can actually play the card that you exile off it when it enters the battlefield, but it seems like a pretty cool design and pretty solid card. Next up is Explosive Entry. Destroys an artifact at sorcery speed, and you get a counter on a creature. It's similar to the white version that destroyed an enchantment and gained you 3 life for 1 mana. If there's enough artifacts running around, this could be fine main deckable material. If there aren't enough artifacts running around, I don't think it's going to be particularly main deckable. Though, judging by the number of enchantments and artifacts we've seen around, I'm leaning towards the fact that these might be main deckable just because your opponent's probably going to have some artifact that you can use it on. And this is a pretty good removal spell for that sort of thing. But in the very least, it's going to be a great sideboard card. So this might actually be a high priority card. I'll have to do more detailed breakdown on how many artifacts are in the set, how many are like playable for each color combo. But it looks like a pretty good card to have access to, especially out of the sideboard. So you might have to prioritize taking it. Next is Gifts of Wrath. So it's an enchantment. So it's like one of those auras that you can use to get modified. And you enchant a creature, it gets +2/+2 menace. And when this card leaves, so if your creature dies or the aura gets destroyed, then you're going to get a 2/2. So like It's kind of a weird design. I don't think it's a high priority. Just 4 mana auras. You can still get blown out if your creature gets killed in response. And so I just don't think that it's going to be worth playing a lot of the time or prioritizing in the draft phase. Next is Ironhoof Boar. This card looks sweet to me. It's an artifact creature, so that's already nice because artifact creatures are good synergy. Unless everyone's running artifact removal, in which case it being an expensive artifact creature means it's going to get blown out more often. But I'm starting off with this being upside for your artifact synergies. It's got Trample Haste, so 6 mana, 5/4 Trample Haste, so it really does hit pretty hard. And you can use it as a combat trick if you don't have that mana. Just seems like an excellent card to me. Combat trick when you don't need it, when you can't cast it. Incredibly punishing like attacker when you can use it. So I'm overall pretty excited to play the Ironhoof Boar. I think it's going to be a pretty good pick for your deck. And a card that even if you're not particularly, like if you're going to want this in your aggressive deck, you're not going to necessarily want it outside of your aggressive decks because the combat trick and the creature aren't good if you're not aggressive. But I think overall it's going to be a pretty good card for your aggressive decks. And red decks are often aggressive. So Ironhoof Boar seems like a pretty good card to me and a nice one to have access to. And probably one that other players are going to want to have access to as well. So probably one you're going to have to take pretty early. Next is Kami of Industry. 5 mana for a 3/6. Not particularly good for aggressive strategies, but it can get back one of your artifacts from the graveyard temporarily. So that's good with artifact creatures. It's also good if you have ways to sacrifice those artifacts, which is nice. So like you get back your artifact and then you sacrifice it to some other effect. It's kind of hard to have extra mana lying around with your when you're playing your Kami on the same turn. But maybe you get to 7 mana, you play this, get your artifact back, and then you sacrifice it to your the black card that we saw earlier that lets you sacrifice an artifact to draw 2 cards. So Kami of Industry seems like it could have some nice synergies with those and not really playable outside of that deck, so not a high draft pick. Next is Kami's Flare, probably the best red common. Just 2 mana, deal 3 to a creature or planeswalker, and 2 damage to that permanent's controller if you control a modified creature. So I don't expect it to be too difficult to have a modified creature, and so just killing a creature and dealing 2 to their face is just very good at instant speed. Just a fantastic card and going to be one of the best commons in the set. And just take these early, play them often. Next is Kindled Fury. We've seen this card in the past. It was never been particularly good. It's just a very low impact combat trick. You can sometimes play it if you need a combat trick, but overall not a super high priority. Next is Peerless Samurai. This is another one of those attacks alone payoff cards. It makes your next spell cast 1 less. So it's important to note that you can still cast multiple spells. It's just only the next one costs less. So you can either use this to, if you play it on turn 3, on turn 4, you can either play a 2-drop and a 3-drop, or you can play a 5-drop a turn early. And because it has menace, it's going to be pretty easy to hit with. Having menace might also be nice if you have some incidental ninjas in your deck, and generally just like a nice little upside to have on your creature. I think generally it's not going to be a high pick because it's only really good in that samurai deck potentially, and even then it's not like super great. It's fine on its own, but on turn 4 you still generally want to be able to attack with all of your creatures so that you can like use your combat tricks and stuff like that. It's a 3-drop, it's not a high priority, and it's going to be fine if you do end up playing it even outside of like a dedicated samurai deck. It's going to be fine, but not really a big priority pick. Next is Scrapyard Steelbreaker, 4 mana, 3/4 artifact creature. So mediocre stats, but it can sacrifice another artifact to buff itself until end of turn. It can do that at instant speed, so it has big threat of activation going on. So your opponent probably won't want to block it with their 4/4s or things of that nature, because you can just sacrifice it if you have an artifact lying around. Not a high priority, not a like particularly great card, but if you end up putting it in your deck, it'll do stuff. So not a card you're gonna have to take early or anything, but it's a fine card. Next is the Shattered States Era. This one is a really sweet design. It's a 5-drop, so I don't think you can take it too highly and play too many copies, but it's a really cool one. So basically, you steal your opponent's creature, and hit them with it for a turn. Note that you do have to give it back, and like because you only gain it until end of turn, there was the Akroan War back in Theros Beyond Death, where you got to keep your creature until the Saga left play, and I'm sure players will assume that that is still the case here, just because it's a similar kind of effect. But you do give it back at the end of the turn. But you steal their creature, and then you get to buff all of your creatures, and then it flips into a 3/3 with Trample and Haste. So generally a pretty nice effect. You're not gonna it's just a great curve topper for an aggressive strategy. That's pretty much plain and simple what it is. It's gonna be all 3 modes are good for your aggressive decks. You're not gonna want it in your control decks, but red decks, as I said, are oftentimes aggressive anyway, and so this will get the job done. And I think it's gonna be a card you have to be aware of because your opponents are gonna be playing this card, and so you don't necessarily just want to leave back your one big blocker if you're playing against a red deck, because this card seems quite powerful to me. Definitely worth. I think it's going to be the sort of card that red decks really want to have at least one copy of, just because it completely changes the way your opponent has to play the game if they know you have access to this sort of card in your deck. So it seems quite powerful to me. Probably worth investing an early pick into getting a copy. Next is Simeon Sling. It's a pretty cool card. 1 mana 1/1 isn't great stats, but it is an artifact creature for those synergies, and it has modified. I mean, not modified, reconfigure, which plays well with modified, plays well with artifact synergies. It can buff up your other creatures so they can attack. And I think it might be just like a key glue piece for different strategies, which seems like it could have good implications for the format. So I'm not sure how highly you're going to have to take it. You might have to take it reasonably highly just so that you have access to it for the decks that care about it. But in other situations, in some decks, you're not going to want it at all. So you're going to kind of have to pick your poison there when it comes to your color combination. Like if you're super early in the draft, you might not want to take it super early, but once you know your colors, in packs 2 or 3, you might have to take it a little higher because it might enable decks really well. Even though it's like a little bit like weak power level wise, it might just like really make the gears turn properly. Next up is Tawashi's Songs Shaper. So 2 mana 2/2 artifact creature, already like pretty reasonable for this sort of set. It fuels synergies that way, and then it also attacks as a 3/2 whenever another artifact enters the battlefield. It can attack as a 4/2 if you have 2 artifacts enter. Overall, just seems like a rock solid card. You might have to invest early picks into these just so you can have enough 2-drops in your deck. And yeah, I think the card just looks pretty good to me. Next is Unstoppable Ogre. 3 mana 1/4 isn't the greatest stats. It is an artifact creature and does have extra utility in stopping your opponents from blocking. The problem is there are some ways to punish 1 toughness creatures. We've seen a few 1/1 creatures that are like for 1 mana that your opponents might be playing more copies of because they're trying to enable their ninjas. And so your opponents might punish you that way. There's just like some ways of like getting rid of 1 toughness creatures that maybe aren't as good, making this card a little bit worse. But it does seem pretty good for your aggressive artifact decks. And red is an aggressive color, so I think the card could do some good stuff. It's maybe not going to be as high of a priority because there are some ways to punish 1 toughness creatures, but the card does still seem good to me, and a card that you're going to be relatively happy playing in your aggressive decks. It just makes it so hard for your opponents to like know how many creatures to leave back on blocks and things of that nature. And then our final red card is another very powerful one, up there in terms of best red commons. It either deals 2 damage to a creature, or you can deal 4 damage if you sacrifice an artifact. And because it is an instant, you can do something like your opponent is using a removal spell on your artifact creature, and so you sacrifice that to your Voltage Surge because it only costs 1 mana. You can maybe have that up and deal 4 damage to one of their creatures, or you can have an artifact that you want to sacrifice anyway, or you can combine it with the 5 mana thing where you steal your opponent's artifact creature with your 5 mana Saga, and then sacrifice it to Voltage Surge to kill their other creature. That could be a devastating 6 mana combo. There's just a lot of applications for this card. It's like probably like right behind the 2 mana deal 3 to your opponent's creature in terms of power level in red commons, and the card looks excellent to me, and you're going to have to take it really highly because everyone's going to want these. Moving on to green, we're starting off with Bamboo Grove Archer. So 2 mana 3/3, great stats, enchantment creature, check for synergy. It's a defender though, not the best, and it has reach, so that's another bonus because there are going to be those evasive creatures as we talked about that your opponents are going to want to be using to enable their ninjas, and this really shuts those down. And it can also just destroy a creature with flying if you get to the late game and they have a flyer that you care about. So seems like a rock solid card. You're going to want to make sure that you have like late game with this because it can't like help you win the game on its own. It can't like pressure your opponent. But if you have some stuff to do in the late game, it seems like a pretty good enabler. It's an enchantment to have in play. And overall, just a pretty solid card. Next up, and also 2-drops are just cards you have to prioritize. You might have to take it like 6th or 7th, even if you don't necessarily want to, just because you need 2-drops in your deck. Though you only want it in your defensive decks. But green is oftentimes more defensive, so there you go. Next is Bearer of Memory. 3 mana 3/2 enchantment creature, and then it has the ability to put counters on enchantment creatures in the late game. It also can give those creatures trample, which is relevant because there are some pretty sizable enchantment creatures, and also it can be used at instant speed, so it can really mess with combat math and let you attack in some cool ways. So overall, pretty solid card, but it's a 3 mana 3/2 that isn't going to be useful until the late game, so not a high priority. Next is Careful Cultivation. The key part of this is the channel ability, which lets you get a 1/1 that can tap for a green mana, which is not the greatest card because a 1/1 for 2 mana is a little bit small, but it also has like some extra utility where you can potentially use the +1/+3 part of the card, especially if you're maybe enchanting an artifact, like a vehicle or something. That could be neat because then you turn your like vehicle into something. Not like the greatest card, but it's fine. And again, it's like a 2-drop in many ways because of the channel ability. So in a ramp deck, you're going to want to take this a little bit higher just so you can start ramping as early as possible. But not like a card that I'm like overjoyed. Like I'm not like taking it like super highly. It's just like going to be a fine card in your deck. So take it in the middle of the pack. Next is Coiling Stalker, a ninja in green. So that's pretty cool. And when it deals combat damage, you get put a counter on a creature you control that doesn't have a counter. I really like that addition of that text because it means you're not going to be able to snowball it out of reach of your opponent's stuff. You're going to be able to like hit your opponent, make it a 3/2, and then your opponent's probably going to be able to trade with it. If they can't, you get to buff your other creature a little bit, but you don't just get to like make this guy bigger and bigger and bigger, so it like outscales what your opponents are doing. It also, like the ninjutsu isn't a discount in the cost, it's just like a benefit because your creature's already going to come in dealing damage. And I think overall, just a good 2-drop to have access to kind of makes it hard, makes your opponent want to block. So it plays well with those sorts of effects that your opponents are going to want to block this creature. And overall, I think it's just a good card. It's going to be pretty like reasonably high pick because it is a 2-drop, and 2-drops are so important for limited. Next is Commune with Spirits, a card that doesn't really have a high impact, but is certainly playable if you have enough enchantments. Because it hits enchantments or lands, you're pretty much always going to hit something when you're looking at 4 cards. But you really want to have the option to like choose between land or spell when you're playing this sort of thing. I think overall, it's probably going to be like a card that you're fine playing a couple copies of, but unless you like really have a certain enchantment you're trying to dig for, like a really powerful one, you're not going to like take it super highly. Next is Fade into Antiquity. This card could be really good. I think this one's certainly main deckable. We've seen enough artifacts and enchantments that we know that every deck is going to have either one or the other, and sometimes both. And so you're going to have targets for this. And so it's going to be like a 3-mana kill spell that exiles in a lot of cases. So this is a really powerful green common, and one you're going to have to take early because I think other players are going to know that this is also where you want to be in the format. Next is Fang of Shigeki. I think this card's pretty good. It's an enchantment creature on turn 1 to get that rolling. It's a Death Toucher, so it's going to trade for anything. And it's also a cool way to enable your ninja cards. So maybe you're playing blue-green and you have some ninjas, or green-black and you have some ninjas. There are some green ninjas. And so you're able to enable your own ninjas because a 1/1 Death Toucher, they're often not going to want to block it with their bigger creature. And because the ninjas exist, maybe they're going to feel like they have to block it with their bigger creature, so you trade it for like their 3/3 or their 2-drop, or really anything that doesn't cost 1 mana. You're going to be getting an advantage. And so Fang of Shigeki looks very good to me. And even though 1 mana 1/1 Death Toucher isn't always premium in a format, in this format it looks really good, especially because it's also an enchantment creature for those synergies. So looks like a great card. And don't sleep on the Shigeki because it might get you with its fangs. Next up, we have Favor of Jukai. It is 4 mana for +3/+3 and reach, or you can discard it to use it as a combat trick. So basically, it's a combat trick that has like some random like in aura mode. You're generally not going to want to use the aura mode because it does expose you to 2-for-1s, but in some cases you're going to want to do that. Maybe you have modified synergies, or you just want to make a big creature because you don't think your opponent has removal. But also, it's like an uncounterable combat trick, which is just nice to have access to sometimes. Not a high priority pick, but definitely can be played. You've seen +3/+3 and reach be a fine combat trick in the past. Next is Geothermal Kami. 4 mana 4/3, so not the greatest stat line, and generally that it has just a 4-drop with mediocre stats and a marginal ability. It's not going to be a high priority, but you can return enchantments to your owner's hand, so you can like reset your sagas if you really care about that, or things of that nature, or like if your creature is like put under one of those removal spells, you can like return it to your hand. But generally not like a super like devastatingly high impact card, so you're probably going to be okay playing this, but you're not going to prioritize it in any way. Next is Grafted Growth. So this is a pretty cool one because it's going to be able to ramp you, but if you have a 2-drop, it's also going to make that 2-drop able to hold the fort longer, and also make that 2-drop like be a more effective like modified enabler or things of that nature. I think the card could actually be pretty good if there is a supported ramp deck. Sometimes ramp isn't super well supported because the format's too fast or there's nothing worth ramping into. But in this set, because the channel abilities make cards sometimes like they might put more expensive cards in the set because channel lets you have like some way to still use them. Grafted Growth could be good in that sort of strategy. And also putting counters on your creatures can be really good for enabling modified stuff. And so it kind of could fit well into a very narrow band of decks. So maybe not a high priority pick, but once you're in the right deck, it could be very good. And it could just be the case that a lot of green decks care about doing this modified rampy strategy, in which case Grafted Growth would be quite good. Next up is Greater Tanuki. I think the card's quite good. 6 mana, 6/5, trample is just like already reasonable stats. Like 6 mana, 6/6 trample is usually like a decent card. It's an enchantment creature, so upside there / downside because of the enchantment removal we've seen. And then it also has channel, so you can discard it to get a basic land card and put it into play tapped, which is just really nice because early in the game, you're probably going to want to do that to ramp, especially if you have multiple Greater Tanukis, so you can just get them out early. You can ramp into your other spells. You can splash easier. This card just does it all. It's fantastic. I think it's going to be a high pick just because it's like good early, good late, and it's an enchantment creature for synergies. And it helps you splash. And so it just seems like it comes to the intersection of a lot of what green wants to do. And so I'm excited to play this card. It looks great. Next is Harmonious Emergence. It's kind of similar to the red enchantment, or we saw earlier, it enchants one of your lands, makes it into a 4/5 with vigilance and haste. And so, and then if it would be destroyed, you get to like keep it as a land essentially. So yeah, the benefit of this is that this one is like a 4/5 vigilance, and that's just pretty sizable for 4 mana. It comes into play tapped, like 4 mana 4/5 vigilance come into play tapped. And it's also a little bit worse in green to have this effect, because in green you're often going to be tapping your mana, like tapping out for like your big threats over and over the course of turns. So you're less likely to want to have a creature that kind of gets rid of a land slot, but it will work with your modified stuff still. And so I think it's like a little bit worse than the red version because it just costs more, but I still think the card's good. So, like not like insanely good, but like worth playing. So like maybe you're fine taking it like 8th or 9th. Maybe you're not going to want it in every deck, but I think having a modified creature and the fact that you can like attack with it and then tap for mana with it is especially relevant because it has vigilance. And a 4/5 is really hard to tangle with. So the vigilance is really key on that. So yeah, I think the card's going to be pretty solid, but it's a 4-drop, so it's not really a high priority in the draft phase. Next is Heir of the Ancient Fang. 3 mana 2/3, not the greatest stats, but it enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter if you control a modified creature. So you really care about having those early modified creatures, or early creatures that can gain counters or things of that nature. And so, or you have to play this a little bit later in the game. But generally, a 3 mana 3/4 would be really good, and a 3 mana 2/3 is not good enough. So you're only going to want this in your modified decks. It's looking like green has a lot of modified synergies, but not necessarily going to be the greatest in every deck. It's also a samurai for if you get those synergies incidentally. But yeah, my ultimate conclusion on this card is it's not a high pick, but you'll sometimes play it if you can enable it. Next is Jukai Preserver. This is 4 mana 3/3. It's an enchantment creature, so that's nice. And when it enters, you put a counter on a creature. So it's like a 4 mana 4/4 essentially, but you can put the counter on something else if that's more beneficial. And then you can discard it to put a counter on each of up to 2 creatures for 3 mana. So it can be a pretty devastating combat trick, or a 4 mana 4/4 enchantment creature with modified synergies. And that seems like enough for this to be a pretty good card. I think it's going to be a high pick. Because it can make combats a nightmare for your opponent if they know that you have it, or just be a 4 mana 4/4, and 4 mana 4/4 is just a good stat line, and it's an enchantment creature, so yeah, pretty good card, and one you're gonna probably be seeing a lot of. Next is the Jukai Trainee, a 2 mana 2/2 that makes it hard to block, or it makes it hard if it tangles with other creatures in combat, so kind of like a Bushido callback, also a Deeproot Warrior callback for those Ixalan fans. Shout out to Ixalan. But yeah, this card's going to play out pretty good. It's a premium 2-drop. It's one you're going to have to take pretty early because it's just going to be dealing a lot of damage in combat or be very effective on blocks. And like a 2 mana 3/3 is just a good card. And it's pretty similar to a card that was in original Kamigawa, which was like this frog ninja card. Actually, maybe it wasn't in original Kamigawa. I think it was actually in Modern Horizons 2. It was a frog ninja card, but it had Bushido. So yeah, I was thinking original Kamigawa, but yeah. The card just is quite good, and you're going to have to take it early because you need to have 2-drops in limited, and so this is going to be a premium 2-drop for any green deck, aggressive or defensive. Next is Master's Rebuke, the premium green removal of the set. This card actually looks just great to me. It's very similar to Ram Through from Ikoria, which was a card that I thought was pretty good, even if maybe others didn't necessarily like it as much. It's just like, this is what green gets in terms of removal. It looks like there's some pretty sizable creatures in green, and because it's an instant, it's a little bit easier to avoid blowouts with your opponents, like killing your creature in response, and you potentially can blow out your opponents if they don't expect this sort of card. So I think Master's Rebuke is a great card. It's going to be a very high pick because green needs interaction, and Master's Rebuke is pretty good interaction. So definitely a card that's worth prioritizing. Next is Season of Renewal. You can choose one or both. You return a creature card or an enchantment card from your graveyard to your hand. So nice little card advantage for green. It's instant speed. So you can use this in a case where maybe your creatures trade off on your opponent's turn and you just return one of your creatures and one of your enchantment creatures. Because there's so many enchantment creatures, I'm assuming that you're going to be able to get those into your graveyard. They also have channel abilities a lot of the time. So maybe you use your Greater Tanuki early in the game to discard it into your graveyard, and then you use your Season of Renewal to get it back. Because there are so many channel creatures, I think this card's oftentimes just going to be 3 mana, draw 2 spells, which seems excellent to me, and probably a card you're going to be pretty happy playing, and maybe even a high pick as a result. It's hard to say sometimes whether it's a high pick, because like it's a card advantage spell for 3 mana, so maybe not as good. But the fact that you're drawing 2 spells like every time with this, and channel makes it really easy to get 2 creatures and creature enchantments into your graveyard, means that I think you're going to be having access to this card, and it seems quite powerful. So yeah, I think Season of Renewal is going to be a high pick. Next is Tales of Master Sashiro. So for 5 mana, you get to put a counter on a creature, and it gains Vigilance. So Vigilance shouldn't be understated. Vigilance actually does have a nice impact. And so you're going to be able to do that twice. So you get 2 counters, and then it flips into a 5/5 with Vigilance and Haste. So 5 mana for a 5/5 Vigilance Haste would be a great card. The fact that you get a delay on that for a couple turns isn't the best, but you do get a couple of extra counters. So if the game's going to keep going, you get those extra counters, so 5 mana for almost 7/7 worth of stats, and you get Vigilance a couple turns, and it's an enchantment creature and enchantment synergies. I think the card's pretty good. It's a nice like curve topper. It'll help like you survive by giving your other creatures vigilance and counters. It'll help you get more modified creatures because you can spread those counters around to more creatures so they can be more modified stuff. And also just a 5/5 vigilance haste at the end is a pretty good payoff. So I think Sashiro's Living Legacy is going to perform pretty well as a card, though it is a 5-drop, so maybe you can't prioritize it as highly in the draft, even though I think you will actively want to have a copy or two. Next is Tamio's Safekeeping. So it's an instant that basically just protects your creatures from removal, or if they're going to trade in combat. So like if it's a 3/3 versus a 3/3, you can use this or something of that nature. Gives hexproof and indestructible, and you gain 2 life. So pretty nice for protecting your creature. It's very cheap to use, and I think it's overall going to be pretty solid. And a card that like you're not going to like prioritize super highly because it doesn't like buff stats or anything. But if you have to play a couple of this, if you have to play a copy of this in your deck, it's going to do its job. And if you have a bomb rare that's especially worth protecting, it's going to get a little bit of a nudge there. So I don't think you have to take it highly, but if you play a copy in your deck, it might just really, it'll make a difference in the games where you draw it, I feel like, a lot of the time. So yeah, a card that's worth taking, at least making sure you get a copy of for your green deck. Moving on to some artifacts. We start with Automated Artificer, 2 mana 1/3 artifact creature, and you can tap for colorless only to cast artifacts. I just think this is a little bit too inefficient. 2 mana 1/3 is not good enough stats. The fact that it can only cast artifact spells isn't going to be relevant for all that many decks. So if you do want to have access to this card, you're probably going to be able to get it late in the draft. And so some decks will want to play it because they'll have enough artifacts that this is pretty good as a mana dork, but a lot of decks won't, so you won't have to prioritize it. Next is Brute Suit. So 3 mana for the 4/3 Vigilance, as we were talking about earlier with that Fox Pilot, the one that can, when it crews a vehicle, untap itself. Vigilance is kind of like sometimes hard to use with vehicles because you just run out of creatures to crew them with. But 4/3 Vigilance for 3 mana, only 3 mana, even though it is a vehicle, it's reasonable. If you have some vehicle synergies, you might want to play it. If you just like need an extra beater for your aggressive deck, maybe you'll play it as well, because vehicles can help your smaller creatures be relevant in the late game, which is pretty nice. And Brute Suit does hit pretty hard. It's going to be able to attack past most creatures, or at least threaten a trade. And so as a result, probably not a high pick, but a card that's worth playing in some strategies. Next is Dramatist's Puppet. So 4 mana for a 2/4. And then when it enters the battlefield, you can like put an extra counter on a creature if it has a +1/+1 counter, which is usually going to be the case. There's not really any like negative counters in this set at common or uncommon, and or ability counters, though there are some ability counters at higher rarities. But basically, you're going to be able to play a 4 mana 2/4, and then you choose a permanent and you put an extra +1/+1 counter on it, which is just not a super efficient card. 4 mana for a 3/5 wouldn't be like the greatest stat line, and this is like much worse than that because you're not necessarily going to be getting that extra counter and things like that. So I don't think you're going to want to take this card or play it. Next is Ecologist's Terrarium. So a pretty cool card for splashing. So you can basically play this in the early game to get an extra land, and then later on you can put a counter on a creature. So nice little bit of extra value. And I think overall, because there's some artifact synergies, because there's stuff that cares about you sacrificing artifacts, because there's some stuff that might want you to splash or things like that, I think Ecologist's Terrarium is actually going to see a decent amount of play, but it's probably not going to be a card that you take super highly because I think you want to be splashing before you play the Terrarium, or you want to have some of those other synergies. And so once you have those, the Terrarium becomes more appealing. But overall, it just looks like a pretty good card to me, just not a high pick. Like one of those ones that's like, okay, every time you draw it, it generally does its thing, but it never is like super overpowering or a card you really prioritize. And not every deck wants it, because if you're aggressive, you don't really care about this. And a lot of mid-range decks won't care about it either. Next is Iron Apprentice. So it's a 1/1 for 1, essentially, and then if it dies, you can put counters on another creature. It's worth noting that you can put multiple counters onto the Iron Apprentice, and then it'll give all of those counters to other things. So that's pretty good. It does get punished by like them bouncing it if you're like heavily investing counters into it, but it just seems like a reasonable card. There was Star Pupil in Strixhaven, which had this very similar text pretty much, and that card ended up being solid, if not great, partly because the counter synergies didn't come through as much. But in this set, it looks like there's a lot of +1/+1 counter synergies that you can maybe use Iron Apprentice well. So it's not a high pick because you need to have those synergies before you want this card, but like it's going to be a fine card in most decks. Like even if you don't have other synergy stuff, like a 1/1 that dies and puts +1/+1 counter on another creature is going to be fine a lot of the time. And so in the right shell, it can do a lot of work. So I don't think it's going to be a high pick. It's not a high impact card, but it could be a nice glue piece for certain decks, and so it could be worth running if you get one a little bit later in the draft. Next is Network Terminal. So 3 mana rock, it can fix your mana, which is nice. So it looks like there's a lot of mana fixing in this set, which means there could be some exciting shenanigans with multicolor decks. And then you can tap an untapped creature to draw a card and discard a card. So you can start looting through your deck once you have too much mana. So it's generally, this sort of effect is a little bit weak on its own, but the fact that it gives that extra looting ability means that maybe it'll have late game applications if you're playing like a multicolor ramp deck. So I wouldn't sleep on this card, but I also wouldn't take it early because it's going to be a very niche playable card. Next is Ninja's Kunai. So 1 mana for a equipment that has only equip 1. So really easy to get onto your creature. And then you have to pay an extra mana, sacrifice it, and tap the creature to deal 3 to any target. So you can finish off your opponent. Usually you're going to use it to kill your opponent's creatures. And I really like the aspect of this where it's not going to buff your creature's stats, but it is going to help you get a modified creature early in the game. So if you are a modified deck or a deck that cares about modified, then the Ninja's Kunai could be a great enabler for that sort of strategy. And so I think as a result, the card's going to be a pretty, like, you're going to take it like in the middle of the pack maybe just because it's like good, like it's just decent removal and also helps you with your modified shenanigans and synergies. And so I think the Ninja's Kunai could be a pretty good card in the format, even if it looks relatively low impact on its surface. I think it's going to have synergy with the rest of the format to the point where it's going to be a pretty good card. And yeah, I think I'm pretty excited to see how it plays out. Next is Papercraft Decoy. So 2 mana, 2/1 artifact creature. So that's nice. And then when it leaves the battlefield, you can pay 2. And if you do, you draw a card. So one cool thing with this is if your opponent doesn't choose to block it and you ninjutsu a creature in off of it, you can still draw the card. It doesn't have to die. It just has to leave the battlefield. So that's worth knowing. And it's also worth knowing that if it dies, you can pay 2 and draw a card. So 2 mana, 2/1 that can replace itself pretty easily. Seems like a good card to me. You need 2-drops, as I've been saying. And this one seems like a pretty good one. So I think you're going to actually be like seeing a lot of these because a lot of decks are just going to play it. Like they'll need they'll need an extra 2-drop and they'll just put the Papercraft Decoy in their deck. So might even be a decently high pick just to ensure that you're going to lock up like a solid 2-drop for your deck. Next is Searchlight Companion. So 3 mana for a 1/1 flyer, artifact creature that also comes with a 1/1 spirit token. So plays well with sacrifice synergies, plays well with evasion, and like it's pretty solid with ninjutsu stuff because it's a 1/1 flyer that comes into play with another token. So you can bounce it back to your hand, play it again, get another 1/1 token on the ground. So it has enough synergies where I think that even though it's low power, it's going to be worth playing in some decks. And so you might have to take it in the middle of the pack instead of just relying on it wheeling all the time or things of that nature. Next is Shrine Steward. So there are shrines coming back to this set. And so there's a 5 mana 3/2 that lets you put a shrine into your hand. So if you are building a shrine deck, that can be very important because the more shrines you get into play, the better. There also are a decent number of auras in this set, so that can be pretty good as well. And there are some auras with channel ability, so it's not even necessarily like you're only getting an aura. You can potentially get some extra upside ability, but it is a 5 mana 3/2, and so that's just such weak stats that you kind of, I think, have to be like a dedicated shrines deck before you're like happy playing this. And so I wouldn't prioritize this card during the draft phase, but sometimes you'll play it in the right deck. Next is Thundersteel Colossus. This seems like the sort of card that having a copy in your aggressive deck could be worth doing. It is a 7-drop, so it's really hard to cast, but it's just going to end the game like so often. Just like 7/7 Trample Haste that's not hard to crew. It just hits like a truck. I don't think it's the greatest card because it is a 7-drop, and so like you just don't have room for 7-drops a lot of the time. But I think that it's like playable, and so if you get a copy of it late in the draft, you might put it in your deck. And then finally, we have some lands to talk about. So there is the full cycle of gain lands in the set, which makes me really excited for the possibilities of splashing whenever these cards are in the set. And with all of the mana fixing we've seen, these cards that come into play, tapped, gain you a life, and then also like can tap for any like one of 2 colors is very good. So there's I'm just gonna I've listed, even though they're all functionally the same as Bloodfell Caves, there's one for each of the 2 color pairs. I just figured it'd be nice to look at the artwork because it is gorgeous. Like really, the artwork does make a big difference in a lot of ways, just to how the game feels when you're playing it. And these are just like absolutely beautiful cards to look at. So yeah, the full cycle is here. They look awesome. I just think that they knocked it out of the park with these lands. And then there's finally Uncharted Haven, which is a land that can be any color that you want, but once you've chosen it, it stays as that color. We saw a similar effect in Kaldheim with the, gosh, what was that card called? I'm thinking of the artwork. Basically, it came into play tapped. It was a snow land, and it could tap for any color. Shimmerdrift Veil or something like that, maybe. But yeah, it can tap for any color. And so it's just a really nice way to fix your mana. It works great in a 3-color deck because it can be either your splash color or your main color. And then, generally speaking, it's just going to stay that color, but it's like an Evolving Wilds effect. It's a little bit worse than the snow one was because that one, like, there were snow synergies in that set, but this one's still just going to be a good land to get to help your deck play out more consistently. Overall, with the gain lands in this card in the land slot and all the mana fixing we've already seen, I think this set could be really cool for splashing and stuff like that. Anyway, that is going to do it for this limited set review for Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. I really do hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for watching. And if you made it all the way to the end of the video, in the comment section down below, leave hashtag neonisnear to let me know you made it all the way to the end of the video. Also, remember to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel for more draft content, including plenty of Neon Dynasty in the coming days. And if you are enjoying my videos in general and you want to help me continue making more videos while also gaining access to a full card-by-card grade tier list that has A through F grades on all the cards, as well as grades on the uncommons and rares and mythics, in addition to all of the commons that we just saw, you can check out the Patreon, patreon.com/NicolaiBolas. And when you do become a patron, you'll gain access to that tier list while also supporting my content and helping me continue to produce all of these videos, because patrons really do make a big difference in helping me continue to make all of these videos. You can also find links in the description down below to tons of cool stuff, like my articles, which are free to read, my Discord server, which is free to join and talk about all things Magic and discuss the cards and things like that, the NicolaiBolas Twitch stream, where you can watch me playing live, NicolaiBolas merchandise if you're interested in having some NicolaiBolas like t-shirts or mugs or things of that nature, and just a host of cool stuff in the description down below, so check that stuff out. Anyway, that is going to do it for this video. I really do hope you enjoyed it. I hope you're as excited for Kamigawa Neon Dynasty Draft as I am, and I will talk to you next time.